Welcome to Social Personality Development Unit 8. Here in our last unit, we're going to be talking about all things media and how that can impact our social and personality development. Now what we can see here is I have three main clusters on the screen. I have analog media, that's going to refer to everything that happened before the digital era. Then we have digital media, and then we have social media. And social media really could be nested as a type of digital media. It is a digital media, but I'm including it as its own separate type just because we're going to talk about how this is really more intense in terms of how interactive and how self-curated it can be. Now, important to understand that really a lot of the content for this unit is outside the realm of psychology. It falls into the areas of communication, culture studies, history, and sociology. And for the purposes of this course, we're not going to try and become experts in communications or experts in journalism or sociology, but we're just going to take a walk through history in terms of media. Now, there is going to be a lot of dates presented on some of these slides. I want to say right from the outset that you don't need to know any of the dates. They're just there as milestones to help give you an idea of when things played out. It's also important to understand that a lot of these dates are representing when certain types of media were invented, but in many cases they were not widespread adapted for decades, or even in some cases centuries later. So just some disclaimers up front. And with that being said, let's launch into analog media. So by analog media, I'm really referring to anything that is done before digital technologies really came online. It could be through other types of wired analog technology, or it could be unwired types of media. Particularly when we think about ancient media, we're not looking at anything that uses analog electricity at all. We're talking about things like cosmology, folklore, myth, plays happening in ancient Greek amphitheaters. We could have poems and songs played by bards. We could be talking about the ancient writings in the Torah, or hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt, or ancient Chinese poetry. Now this is considered media, not mass media. It was hard to spread very far, but this helped shape people's lives. It was something people consumed. It was in most cases oral or written narratives passed down over the generations. So how did this media influence people? Well, it shaped their worldviews. It shaped how people thought the world was created, what ethics they should follow, how they should carry out their daily lives. In many cases, these forms of stories became the foundations of many religious followings and became how people orient their lives still today. So this was very impactful. After ancient media, we can really see mass media starting to roll out in the colonial times. And so this is with the invention of the printing press. Again, you don't need to memorize any dates, but for reference, we know the printing press was invented in 1453. Now we know books definitely were invented before this, but books had to be scribed by hand. Think about the ancient Book of Kells. It was something that had lots of intricate Celt knotwork, and it had to be written completely by hand, very onerous, detailed work. With the printing press, we could mass produce books. Books could spread around and be sold and traveled much faster. Literacy rates started to increase. And books didn't have to be of the same highest caliber that they were in the past. Now the standard for what qualified as worthy of press was lowered. You can imagine that people started to be critical about the smut being printed or the stuff that was just not important. Especially given that in 1453, most of Western Europe was very captivated by Christianity. Were they allowed to print non-religious texts? And even the thought of presenting something that didn't support the church could be considered blasphemy. So the media could be seen something as a form of corruption. Now, newspapers started in 1612, but were not widely adapted for another 200 years. But we also have magazines, and we also have photography coming online. And you can imagine the controversy surrounding something like photography. Was it stealing your soul? Was it something that was corrupting you? So I really want to play into the fact that as new media came into culture, we started to become critical of it. We're always critical of what is new and how it might be changing people. Although today we might think about people always have their faces in their phones, you can imagine that when newspapers became popular in the 1800s, that maybe we were critical of those, because rather than face-to-face conversation with other people, we were constantly reading things, and how that may have been considered not so accepted in our social conventions. Now, pardon me, I just realized I have the wrong header on this slide. It should say colonial and not industrialized. We're actually going to leave colonial and move into industrialized. The reason why we're calling it industrialized is this is a lot of media that requires electricity. And so with industrialized media, we're really starting to look at things like the invention of musical records and albums, the use of a gramophone. You didn't need to have live performances. You didn't need to know someone skilled enough to play the piano to listen to piano music. Now you could play the record anytime you wanted. And we can imagine the corruption that the youth were considered to have by wanting to dance and listen to music all hours of the night. As we roll into the early 1900s, we think about the Charleston dance, and we think about the swinging 20s from 100 years ago, and how listening to music and partying was considered this rebellious movement. Then we have the telephone. Though the first telephone signal was sent in 1875 and the first radio signal was sent in 1896, we know that those really picked up steam many decades later, with FM radio really picking up in the 1960s. So these are things that, although they started early, they really started to spike decades later. And so this was a time where now kids and families would sit around and they'd listen to radio programmings in the evening. And how there was writings and debates about how kids are not getting outside and playing sports anymore. They're just sitting inside listening to the radio. And as party lines and landlines started to make their cases in people's homes, people started to say, wow, everybody's just hanging out, eavesdropping on their neighbors, listening to the party line, being nosy-nose, or my kids are talking on the phone all hours of the day. And of course, with the advent of cinema or moving pictures in 1895, now people were captivated. They'd go to the movies. And now we could see widespread use of memes in movies, and really landmark phrases in very classic black and white films have really changed our culture. As Carl Jung would say, having cinema and radio and mass media could really influence what we call the collective unconscious. You just put something in a very popular radio show or a popular movie or popular music, and all of a sudden now everybody's consuming that. Everybody's kind of involved in the same conversation and influenced by the same programming. And so this is how memes could really begin to start, and people could begin to talk about these popular people. And also being the rise of celebrities because everybody knew of them. Moving past the industrial, we're going to get into what we call the mid-century or modernity of the 1950s and beyond. And so television was the idea we could take the moving pictures home. And although television started off pretty primitive, black and white, pretty small, had a little analog dial to switch. Even when I was born in the 1980s, we still had an analog dial, although it was in color, but we only had 13 channels on the earliest TVs I remember. But television was this idea, wow, now you can see things at home. And now instead of gathering around the radio, we can gather around and watch TV. And so if you had a late night talk show, or if you had a certain programming in the news hour, you could really captivate people and really change how they thought. With music, we began to see music become more portable through the use of 8-tracks and cassettes. And again, although cassettes were invented in 1962, I know many people collected albums and records well into the 80s. Again, I was a child of the 80s, so I grew up with a record player in my home as well as many cassette players. And the cellular phone started in 1973. Though I never saw that version. I grew up with lots of cord phones in my childhood, or rotary phones. You had to dial a rotary. And then, of course, there's the VHS. VHS was amazing because you could actually record things on TV. And we'd sit around waiting for the program we want on TV to start to hit record. VCRs with timers came much later, and there was always this joke about trying to get your VCR timer to work seemed impossible. So people would wait at home just to hit. Now, this is when the corruption of the youth became a very lively conversation in the mass media. It was the idea that now there was so much choice. It wasn't just one radio program at night. It wasn't just one newspaper. Now we had our selection of what music we're going to listen to, and if we're going to watch TV on MTV or Much Music, and if that is going to further corrupt us. And it became this idea that now we had these subcultures who listened to different genres of media, and the idea that now we had these different niches. So certainly, if the media was influencing us, became a large concern.